In the previous lesson, we looked at the scopes, and they are really a great asset in helping to correct problems in a video, but how do we correct them? We use the color board to make that happen. Now let's go ahead and go into our inspector, and I have only one clip, Dressage for the instructor. Now the reason I took away the Digital Juice image, that was a Digital Juice of the guy with the baseball, is because if you're buying videos from Digital Juice, don't worry about the color. They are going to be corrected. I've never had a problem with the Digital Juice image, so why bother? Let's go to this one. There are some minor problems that I would like to correct. Maybe I'm not sure exactly what they are yet, but let's look at what's called the color board. Now you can get it in a couple of places. If I come down here to my little magic wand button, Enhancements menu, there they are right here. Or if I want to, and I have it selected over here, I can go into Correction 1. You can have more than one correction, and we can click right over here and get the board. The color board is composed of three areas: color, saturation, and exposure. Believe it or not, I do a lot of my actual color correction without ever going to color. I do that in saturation and exposure. The right mix of saturation and exposure can actually rebalance color in an image. Now let's look at what we have. These are called pucks, P-U-C-K-S. We have one that controls color in the shadow areas, in the midtones, and in the highlights, and we have a global. Let's do this too. Let's go ahead and reopen our scopes. That's going to give us a smaller image, but we will use that. And let's go into, say, for example, vector scope. Now, vector scope gives me the saturation values of the colors. Watch what happens if I take my global, which means like change everything, spin the color wheel. Watch what happens over there on the left. Well, it's putting the colors into different areas. There's yellow. Now, here's the problem that I have with this new approach to the color board. We have the colors up here: red, green, and blue. Actually, there's cyan, magenta, and yellow. If you pull them up, you're going additive color, meaning more red, green, or blue. If you pull them down, you're getting more subtractive color, which is cyan, magenta, and yellow. The confusing thing to me, until you just get used to it, is if I pull this down, watch the image, I'm adding yellow, yet this area down here still shows blue. Now, in an earlier version of Final Cut Pro, they used a color circle, which emulated the difference in colors from additive subtractive. So it's something you kind of got to get used to. But of the color board, this is the only one where you can move the pucks anywhere you want to. You typically don't want to move these things more than about 10% off that line, unless you're doing some type of special effect. The next one is saturation. Now, from saturation to exposure, the next two, you can only move these up and down. Makes them easier to work with. On the left is global. Now, remember that I told you in the previous lesson that the vector scope actually gives you information on the saturation of the colors where they are. If I go to global and pull the color out, watch what happens to the vector scope. Well, it's got nothing to show me. So it's nothing but you in saturation of the colors. Now you go up like this. You've got 100% saturated in most areas. You can see it bleeding way out here almost to the edge. It shows you the saturation values of the image and in shadows, midtones, and highlights. So let's go ahead and switch over here to the histogram. And let me change it to a RGB overlay so you can see the colors. Now watch what happens again when I pull that down. They all come together. We've lost chroma. We're looking at luminosity. When you take the color out of an image, or a video in our case, you're equalizing the red, green, and blue channels. They all have the same values, and you get a shade of gray as opposed to color. And again, we can go into shadows, highlights, and midtones. Shadows are about this percentage of the histogram. Midtones is the big part in the middle, and highlights kind of come out here at the end. Last one is exposure. Think like a camera, changing exposure. And if we come here, we can lighten or darken, but see what it's doing to the histogram. Now we can see the same thing if we go into, say, our waveform. Now that's global. Now let me reset that. Now I look at this image, and the first thing I see, either from the histogram or the waveform, is that we have information that extends above 100 right here. And what I would like to do is get that underneath 100 to make it partially broadcast safe, but also I'd like to see if I could recapture the stuff that's being blown out in the highlights. Now to do that, I'm going to start with exposure. This is typically how I work. Exposure, saturation, and if I have to, color. In exposure, my goal is to get this information down below 100 without really distorting the image that much. So I'm going to go into my highlights and see what I can do. I can move it down underneath. Now you can see the image too. I like to work with both. If you've ever flown or you know somebody that flies, there are two kind of classes of pilots, VFR and IFR. VFR are visual flight rules, IFR are instrument flight rules. If you're VFR certified, you have to have a clear day. You can't fly in clouds. You are looking out the window. You're looking at the horizon. We're looking at our picture. If you're IFR, you're qualified to fly in clouds and trust your instruments. So our scopes are IFR and our photograph is VFR. I say use both. Now I like that. It's brought it down and I like what it's done to the image over here. If I go to midtones, well, let me do this one first. Obviously, I can do the same thing over here with my blacks. This is kind of the mid-tone area right here. I like to keep that below 50, but sometimes maybe a little bit higher than that. So I'm going to pull that up just a little bit, about like that. So my next goal might be to go to saturation. Now in saturation, what I want to do here, and actually let's then go to our vector scope. Now we're on the right line for flesh tones. I don't need to really change much, but I want a little bit more saturation in the mid-tone area. And I'm going to come here, and you can use your arrow keys if you want to, up, down. I'm going to bring that up just a little bit and watch that scope so it doesn't change too much. Don't go more than about 10% unless you're doing something really interesting, special effect maybe. At this point, I don't really think I need to make any changes in color, but if I did, it looks like it's a little bit either on the cyan or maybe even the yellow side. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to pop that up once or twice. I'm using my arrow keys to make it more precise because you can go left, right, up, or down with this, don't forget. Now, anytime you want to see what it looks like before and after, we can come back to this button here, and we can turn it on and off right here. And if we would like to see maybe a bigger image, we can click right here and do it in full screen. Now, I don't know what kind of monitor you're using for these videos and if it's color corrected or not, but that is a significant change. So my rule of thumb here when I'm working is I start with exposure, go into histogram, or I go into waveform, and I get this lined up here and here. If I can, I then go into saturation, and then finally, if I need it in color, usually I use my arrow keys, left, right, up, or down, to very precisely make that change. If you're working in the color board, I'd recommend you start with exposure, then you go to saturation, and if you need it, you go to color. 1, 2, 3. So let's call this a 3-step process to color correcting an image.